Hi, I'm Marcin Kuśmierczyk. Welcome to Eastern Insights. Why does Eastern Europe's perspective on global affairs matter? Because here, history and geopolitics collide in ways that shape our world. Yet these voices often go unheard. This podcast bridges this gap. Each episode translates in-depth analysis from my Polish YouTube channel, Polityka Zagraniczna, which means international politics. For the last few years, this platform has dissected foreign policy, security, and the forces shaping Eastern Europe. Using AI tools like 11 Labs, we adapt these nuanced insights into English, preserving their depth while making them accessible to all. Whether we're unpacking Russia's latest moves, EU debates, or security challenges in Central Europe, our mission is simple: to foster informed dialogue by sharing Eastern Europe's untold stories. If you're curious about the world beyond headlines, subscribe now. Join me as we decode the complexities of global affairs, one Eastern European insight at a time.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today we're diving deep into a fascinating and frankly, huge topic: the recent political crisis in Ukraine. This crisis, the biggest since the war began, really highlights both the great weaknesses and, paradoxically, the immense strength of the country. We're going to talk about corruption in Ukraine and how it connects to a significant misstep by Volodymyr Zelensky involving Viktor Orban. For many years, in fact, for many decades, corruption has undeniably been one of the most significant social and political problems in Ukraine. Now, I'll be honest, I don't always put much stock in those international rankings that try to classify countries in these kinds of categories. For corruption, the most popular one is the Corruption Perception Index. But that index can be a bit strange. For example, Poland often ranks worse than Rwanda, Botswana, or Georgia. However, when it comes to Ukraine, all the studies, and especially those that survey Ukrainians themselves, consistently show that corruption is an extremely serious issue. In one such study from 2023, a staggering 88% of Ukrainians felt that political corruption was a very important problem for their country. And frankly, society has good reason to think so. Politicians have been providing those reasons for years. For instance, in 2023, one Ukrainian vice minister was detained, allegedly for taking a $400,000 bribe. Another deputy minister was accused of inflating the prices at which the Ukrainian state was buying food rations for soldiers. I could give you many, many more examples of this type. This kind of corruption, where it's at the expense of great power and involves huge sums of money, is the biggest problem. But here's the silver lining: the very fact that I can give you these examples shows that someone in Ukraine is trying to fight this corruption. It shows that even the Ministry of National Defense was under scrutiny, that someone was checking whether this money was being spent appropriately. And this brings us to the National Anti-Corruption Bureau. Corruption in Ukraine was a serious obstacle for Western institutions. And it was these Western institutions that actually forced the creation of a new apparatus specifically designed to combat it. The International Monetary Fund and the European Union, specifically the European Commission, imposed the requirement on Ukraine to create these new anti-corruption institutions. This is an extremely important aspect of the whole issue, because the establishment of these institutions within the Ukrainian political system, the creation of this new anti-corruption apparatus, was all based on the involvement of Western institutions. In this way, the fight against corruption became a standard program for Ukraine's integration with the Western world. These were not supposed to be institutions that depended on the executive power in Ukraine. Rather, they were meant to be institutions that even the executive powers in Ukraine would have to answer to. Meanwhile, quite unexpectedly, and at a very fast pace, the ruling camp, of course, centered around President Volodymyr Zelensky, adopted a law that would de facto end the independence of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau. It did this by subordinating the bureau to the Prosecutor General, who is essentially the president's man. The Prosecutor General would not only have oversight over all investigations, meaning the president would have insight into all investigations, but at the same time, he would also have the right to issue direct orders to investigators. So, this wouldn't just be some kind of soft supervisory control, but in fact, a complete change in the nature of this institution. It would essentially become an institution under the control of the presidential office, or the executive power in Ukraine. So, why did Volodymyr Zelensky decide to take such a drastic step? Well, there can be at least three answers to this question: the official one, the probable one, and the international one. Let's start with the official reason, because the president had to justify his position somehow, and that justification, of course, is the war. In the opinion of the president's entourage, or the ruling camp, Russian influence is supposedly spreading within anti-corruption institutions. There have been some searches, and the general suggestion is that Russians are embedded there, so these institutions must be taken over during wartime because it threatens national security. And while there is a genuine risk of Russians trying to infiltrate such institutions, the president's actions make it look like little more than a pretext. A much more likely reason is that the anti-corruption office was actually working, and it was scrutinizing the actions of people associated with Zelensky. In June of this year, charges were brought against a Ukrainian deputy prime minister and a man said to be close to Zelensky personally and privately. In this particular case, the individual was accused of five-folding reducing the value of shares that the Ukrainian state sold to a developer in Kyiv. And such a decisive move, such a drastic action by the government camp, only fuels the rumors and speculations about what other investigations were ongoing in the anti-corruption office and who else might receive charges in the near future. Perhaps that was the true reason for Zelensky's actions.
But there's also an international answer, an international thread that I find extremely interesting. Because again, the very existence and location of these institutions stem from Ukraine's international context. So, the actions surrounding these institutions also have to be understood through how Ukrainians perceive that international context. This tells us a lot about how Ukrainians view the West today, especially the European Union. And it also, in a way, puts an end to a certain charade associated with Ukraine's potential membership in the European Union. Europe simply won't refrain from military aid for Kyiv today. The war is, in a sense, separate from this issue, because Europe's support today is driven by deeper strategic reasons. It's about the stance of the Russian Federation, and the fact that without the Ukrainian army, without Ukrainian support, Europe is exceptionally vulnerable to becoming a pawn in negotiations between Russians and Americans. Generally, issues related to justice and corruption can influence a whole range of other issues. But war-related issues mean higher risks in terms of security calculations. In that sphere, it seems Ukraine can be sure of European support today. In such a situation, practically the only lever that forces Ukrainians to implement or maintain a number of reforms can be economic, trade, or political integration with the West, especially with the European Union. But this lever can only be effective if it's real. The issue of access to the European market could be seen by Ukrainians as already resolved. At the end of June this year, the European Commission announced the end of negotiations on this matter. And by the way, the Polish Minister of Agriculture issued a very sharp statement on this, expressing great disappointment with the decision. He stated that the European Commission made this decision to end negotiations without prior consultation with member states and agricultural organizations. Okay, but what about full membership in the European Union? Every speech about programming the policy of the European Union, whether by the European Commission, the European Parliament, or most of the presidencies in the Council, is full of empty words about EU expansion. Whether it's about Ukraine and Moldova or the Western Balkan countries. Every time we hear that annoyed, now it's really time, for these momentous steps, a few months pass, and we hear the exact same thing again. In the case of Ukraine, the next political steps on this road are blocked by Hungary. They are blocked by Viktor Orban. And of course, Viktor Orban's stance is a gift from heaven for many in Europe, because Orban states his position directly, as that's what his electorate expects, and that's what he builds his political agenda on. But this allows many pure-hearted people in Europe, who genuinely want to welcome Ukraine into the European Union, to say, oh, it would have happened already if not for this damn Viktor Orban, who's blocking everything. Yet the fact that Hungary not only doesn't block, but even directly advocates for the accession of the Western Balkans to the European Union, and with that accession, things aren't moving particularly fast either, doesn't quite fit into this neat picture. In any case, going back to Ukraine, after a very rapid approach of Ukraine, both economically and politically, to the European Union, in this first stage since the outbreak of the war, Ukrainians could now draw the following conclusions. First, in terms of further political integration, the road is currently closed. Hungary clearly demonstrates this, but it's not only Hungary. Second, regarding economic and trade matters, things seem to be more or less settled. And third, and most importantly, on the fundamental issue of the war, Europe still cannot afford to change its position. It cannot afford to alter its main policy towards Ukraine. And to this, let's add the unambiguous pro-Ukrainian stance of most European capitals regarding this dispute, as well as the widening of relations between Zelensky and Trump, and the positive, or more positive than could have been expected a few months ago, results of the NATO summit, from Ukraine's perspective as well. Ukraine could have felt more confident. It could have felt that there was really nothing to lose. And that's why it thought it could afford to do more. But here, Zelensky made a very rude awakening. The adoption of this law was very widely discussed internationally, which, it seems, the Ukrainians did not expect, but should have expected. Because Ukraine and corruption is a link that strongly evokes emotions in Western societies. The image of a country struggling with corruption often forms the basis for attacks on generally aid to Ukraine in this war. This had to have a wide echo. Because the argument that something is wrong with Ukraine's governance just gained another very serious set of justifications. And the president of Ukraine himself handed these arguments to Ukraine's opponents. So the international pressure started from the ground up and was stronger than the Ukrainians anticipated. But I personally feel that the way this matter played out was even more important because it highlighted the greatest strength and hope for our eastern neighbors. Because this situation exposed a whole range of problems that exist within the Ukrainian state. What mentality is still present at the top of the Ukrainian authorities? How does the Ukrainian political system function? What limitations does the Ukrainian decision-making system have, even during wartime? For what actions can war be justified? How deeply rooted is the problem of corruption? And so on and so forth. But at the same time, this matter also showcased a strong determination still present in Ukrainian society. Massive protests related to the anti-corruption law in a city that is still subject to air attacks. This shows just how much Zelensky angered his compatriots. It shows how much Ukrainians care about a certain direction for their state's development. How much they care about the fight against corruption in their country. This demonstrates a huge dose of determination, because it's not obvious to protest under such conditions. This is something that must have scared Zelensky, especially since there was information that the army also viewed this matter differently. Within such a broad category as a nation or society, we will of course find all types of personalities, all types of people. In Poland, we most often think of Ukrainians through the prism of those who no longer live in Ukraine. But I mean that generally, in this great history that we have been observing for many years, which will actually decide the future of the security architecture of our part of the continent, at least, the will and determination of Ukrainians to have their own country, and to have it possess a certain character determined by society. I mean, this is the factor that was and is politicized by the Americans, by the Russians, even by the Ukrainians themselves, by the leadership of the Ukrainian state. Because thoughtful think about it, how many societies in present-day Europe would be able to wage such a war for more than 3 years? This social factor, this social determination, it's always pushed to the third or fourth plan. And the further we get from some event, for example from the Maidan in 2013-2014, a lot of time has passed. And the longer it is since the Maidan, this emphasis, when it comes to telling what happened, shifts from social protests to some action of special services. Here, the Americans, of course, lead with their God syndrome, because everything that happens in the world had to be, of course, the result of American actions. It couldn't be otherwise. And it's obvious that special services are involved in this type of event. American, Russian, Polish, and every other interested party, for sure. But 1 million people on the streets is, above all, a demonstration of social determination to do something with their country. The course of the war is also the effect of political games, ammunition supply, etc. But it is, above all, a display of social determination, and protesting against undermining anti-corruption institutions during the war is also a display of social determination. This determination, this will to have your own country and a specific direction, it may end one day. I don't know. However, as long as it is visible, ignoring this factor is a colossal mistake, analytically and politically. And it was precisely such a mistake that Volodymyr Zelensky made. He underestimated not only this international space, but above all, he underestimated his own society. And this will lead to the erosion of his political position in Ukraine. Zelensky had to yield under great pressure, both external and internal. They are already working on a new law to restore the independence of anti-corruption institutions, with some mechanisms that are supposed to allow for catching Russian influence. But what's important, representatives of the National Bureau of Anti-Corruption say that this new law actually does restore the independence of this institution. Can we expect more corruption scandals at the highest levels of power in Ukraine? Well, if so, it will mean not only that we are dealing with corruption in Ukraine, but also that someone is trying to fight this corruption in Ukraine. And Zelensky lost a lot. He lost in the international dimension, and he lost in the internal dimension. And this defeat will have an impact on his political future. Thank you very much for your attention today. See you next time.